Later that morning, I awoke crusty-eyed and groggy from the crying and lack of sleep. Upon entering the kitchen, I greeted my family, and my mother replied with her back to me as she's still cooking breakfast. It wasn't until my father loudly inquired about what the hell happened to my face that I became the focus of attention. My mother made comments about my crusty, puffy eyelids, while Jill lovingly compared my appearance to that of fecal matter, which earned a very stern glance from our father. Without thought, I explained that it was the woman under my bed. Before I could go into further detail, my father briskly cut me off. My father was a harsh man who didn't like to be challenged. Once he had closed a case, there were no appeals. He dealt me some choice words and made it clear that this nonsense prank I was pulling was to end, and end immediately. I don't believe any other words were spoken that morning in our entire household. Everyone just quietly played their roles and went about our days. But while I knew better than to utter another word on the subject in the presence of my father, school was a different matter. Joey, my best friend and confidant, believed me without hesitation, and the brainstorming session was on. "She's got to be like some sort of ghost," Joey said while rubbing his non-existent beard. I had known Joey since kinder, and even at the ripe age of 5, he was a supernatural enthusiast. "But I could feel her hand," I replied. He proceeded to explain how not all apparitions are some haunting, ghostly mist. I still didn't understand, but I was willing to accept any explanation more substantial than hallucinations. We, mostly Joey, concluded that she was a lost soul who was stuck on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we didn't know. My biggest issues at the time revolved around Pokemon trading cards and video games. I wasn't equipped to help navigate a ghost towards the light, or whatever it was she needed help with. That would not only require mustering the strength to look again, but also finding some kind of way to communicate with her. Should I call a priest or get a Ouija board? Would my parents even allow that? For the rest of that evening into the night, I avoided my room. Once bedtime came, I wanted to protest, but the look my father gave me spoke louder than words. With shaky legs and shallow breaths, I stepped into my room. Everything looked normal, felt normal. It even smelled normal. Relief and a healthy dose of exhaustion from the day's events washed over me. I hurriedly changed into my PJs and got snuggled into bed. Sleep came to me easier than expected. However, it was not a restful sleep. The nightmares kept me tossing and turning all night. Those damn blue eyes were on the face of everyone I saw. I ran slow-motion dream style through crowds of people, grabbing and pulling at my limbs and clothing. They seemed to be pleading with me for something. I jolted awake, unsure of what time it could have been. The sun hadn't risen yet, so I knew it was still early. I felt a sense of unease in the atmosphere. I knew I had to eventually look again. Better sooner rather than later, I thought. I opened the drawer on my bedside table and felt around until the familiar shape of my flashlight grazed my fingertips. I gave it a good smack with my palm before turning it on. After giving myself a mental pep talk, in which I concluded that none of this was real, I crawled off my bed and onto the floor. I didn't scream this time, or pass out. I just stared in shock and utter disbelief. There she was. The same blue-eyed woman that was the cause of my insomnia that night and for many more nights to come. Her body was bloodied and contorted in such a gruesome way, but it was the look of fear and helplessness in her expression that truly bonded me to my spot. Part of me expected this apparition to rapidly cover the short distance between us and consume me like in the scary movies I wasn't supposed to watch. But she didn't move, blink, or give any indication of life. My stupor finally wore off and I silently crawled back into my bed. I cried myself to sleep, asking the universe, why me, and trying to understand how I was going to fix this. Later that morning, I awoke, crusty-eyed and groggy from the crying and lack of sleep. Upon entering the kitchen, I greeted my family and my mother replied with her back to me as she's still cooking breakfast. It wasn't until my father loudly inquired about what the hell happened to my face that I became the focus of attention. My mother made comments about my crusty, puffy eyelids, while Jill lovingly compared my appearance to that of fecal matter, which earned a very stern glance from our father. Without thought, I explained that it was the woman under my bed. Before I could go into further detail, my father briskly cut me off. My father was a harsh man who didn't like to be challenged. Once he had closed a case, there were no appeals. He dealt me some choice words and made it clear that this nonsense prank I was pulling was to end and end immediately. I don't believe any other words were spoken that morning in our entire household. Everyone just quietly played their roles and went about our days. But while I knew better than to utter another word on the subject in the presence of my father, school was a different matter. Joey, my best friend and confidant, believed me without hesitation, and the brainstorming session was on. "She's got to be like some sort of ghost," Joey said while rubbing his non-existent beard. I had known Joey since kinder, and even at the ripe age of 5, he was a supernatural enthusiast. "But I could feel her hand," I replied. He proceeded to explain how not all apparitions are some haunting, ghostly mist. I still didn't understand, but I was willing to accept any explanation more substantial than hallucinations. We, mostly Joey, concluded that she was a lost soul who was stuck on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we didn't know. My biggest issues at the time revolved around Pokemon trading cards and video games. I wasn't equipped to help navigate a ghost towards the light, or whatever it was she needed help with. That would not only require mustering the strength to look again, but also finding some kind of way to communicate with her. Should I call a priest or get a Ouija board? Would my parents even allow that? All those thoughts, questions, and more continued to rattle through my brain for the rest of the day. Upon arriving home from school, the silence of our empty house was deafening. I was usually the first one home, as both my parents worked until the evening and my sister had cheerleader practice. My usual after-school routine consisted of having a snack while watching TV for about 30 minutes, then straight to homework. It, as well as my daily chores, were expected to be done by the time my parents arrived home, and believe me, Dad was gonna check. But today, I was on a mission. I would have plenty of time for those later. I walked into my room and stood by my bed with all the confidence I could find. I had to figure out what the ghost wanted. I had to help her. After counting down from 10, I dropped to the ground and peered under my bed. In an instant, all the bravado I had moments before was gone. My ghost was still there in the same contorted position with the same look of shock and sadness, but her skin had started to dull and turn this sickly gray color. In some places it had begun to sag and droop, giving the impression that it was going to literally fall off the bone. But it was taut and stretched in others. More specifically on her face, which gave her a gaunt, skeletal appearance. I didn't know much about death at that age, but I had found enough dead animals in the woods to know that this was a look of decay. It wasn't much longer after this realization that its sickly sweet smell hit my nostrils. I dashed to the bathroom, barely clearing the toilet, before my lunch reemerged. By the time my sister got home, I had managed to clean up any remnants of my little episode, but that was about all I had accomplished. She immediately questioned me as to why none of my chores were done. "You know Dad is going to lose his shit," she said. And I knew she was right, but I couldn't even go into my room without gagging. It's like the sight of that decaying specter unlocked the smell, and now it was permeating every inch of my room. After explaining how the situation had worsened, I could see the annoyance all over Jill's face. With an exasperated but gentle tone, she said she was going to prove to me once and for all that this was all in my head. She stood and made a beeline for the closed door, I sprinted in front of her and barricaded the door with my arms spread wide. I begged her to leave it shut. The door was barely keeping the stench at bay. I didn't understand how she couldn't smell it, as the odor was still slowly seeping through the small gap at the bottom. My sister hesitated, and at that moment I could see her irritation turn to concern. Without another word, she walked away. My parents arrived together sometime after 6. We technically didn't have a family car, so my dad would use his work truck to drop off and pick my mom up on his way to and fro. Occasionally, he had far-off jobs, and Mom would catch rides home from a co-worker. Those work trips were a blessing to the rest of us, as it meant we would have a few days without tension and chaos. My dad had only been through the door about 30 seconds before his eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed the knot that had formed in my throat the second I heard the car pull into the yard. I tried to get ahead of his anger by word vomiting what was happening and why I had done no chores. I told him about the decaying skin, the horrendous smell, and those ocean blue eyes. In one swift motion, my father grabbed my arm and dragged me to my bedroom door. His mutterings weren't completely audible, but I was able to make out the phrases, "waste of my time" and "idiotic young'un." These were probably in his top 5 sayings of his lifetime. With a ferocity that we were unfortunate to see on more than one occasion, he swung my door open, nearly ripping it from the hinges. With one hand still gripping my arm, he used the other to lift my bed, frame and all, against the wall. My dad was a naturally large and strong man. Lifting my bed one-handed was easy on a good day. But when he was in a rage, the man probably could move a house. Amongst the violent disarray of my crying and gagging and my father's yelling, I could still see her through my tear-filled eyes, still lying there in her death pose. How could he not see her, smell her? My father pulled me close to his face. He growled through clenched teeth, "If you keep pulling these fucking pranks, there will be a body under this bed, and it will be yours." The house was quiet the rest of the evening, like it always was after one of my father's extreme outbursts. No one spoke a word for 2 days, the first time he broke a television set. My father wasn't exactly what you would call a loving paternal figure. We never had that traditional all-American father-son relationship. From an early age, he had accepted that I didn't possess that same innate aggression as him, and declared me a lost cause. And though the smell radiating from under my bed was insufferable, I knew better than anyone just how deep my father's rage could go. The thought of that was a whole lot scarier than that of the dead ghost girl under my bed. I got little to no sleep that night. I spent the first couple of hours or so gagging and fighting back the urge to expel what little food I had in my stomach. Once I had acclimated to the putrid smell, it was the quiet sobbing that kept me from sleep. I would cry and cry, until I eventually fell asleep, only to be plagued by nightmares of the face that lay below me. I would wake, soaked in sweat and tears, only to start the whole process over. Unfortunately, this was my new normal. Tossing, turning, gagging, and crying all night, followed by complete exhaustion the next day. The lack of sleep was obvious to my family, but no one dared approach the subject, fearing my father's rage. I would occasionally check in on the state of my corpse apparition bunkmate. She continued to disgustingly wither away right before my eyes. I remember thinking I would start to resemble a corpse myself at this rate. And though the sight was gruesome, I had the thought that maybe she would completely decay and dissolve into nothingness. During this time, my nightmares became more vivid. I would see her running in the woods, not jogging, but running in fear. It was like some kind of horror movie. I could feel her fear as she frantically dodged limbs and other forest debris. She would glance back at whoever or whatever she was running from. The look of pure desperation she displayed haunts me more than anything else. The only time I had seen real fear like that before was on TV or in the eyes of my family when my father had one of his more extreme outbursts. It was the fear of knowing something bad was going to happen and that there was absolutely nothing in this world you could do to stop it. As the nights progressed, so did the dreams. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I will spare you the details of her demise. Though it came in the form of a sickening, twisted nightmare, something told me those scenes were too graphic to not be real. And this woman chose to appear to me. She chose to show me these events. But why? What could I do? I started checking the local news websites to see if anyone who looked like her was missing or murdered. But I found nothing. I had started to think that this predicament would end with me withering and perishing away right along with her. Every day I could see the worry in my mother's eyes, but one sharp glance from my father was enough to make the hardest of men shiver. My mother was a small, meek woman who did what her husband told her, at least to his face. Many nights I was supposed to be deprived of dinner, but she would always manage to sneak me a plate in the wee hours of the morning. She saved me many times in more ways than one. After what felt like years, it all ended on one bright, sunny day. I hadn't checked on my specter in a while. By this point, she wasn't much more than a skeleton. The only thing that seemed to resist death's grip was her face. The blue of those eyes never faded. I prepared myself to see that familiar gaze once again, only to find myself looking at a water bottle, a pair of socks, and a baseball mitt. She was gone. I felt a bit of relief, but I felt sadness more than anything. I knew what I had been seeing and experiencing was real. Though I had no proof in those moments, I knew she was real. And I knew what she went through was real. And I hurt for her. No human should go through the atrocities this woman suffered. My family was never religious, but in that moment I prayed that she was at peace. As the day progressed, the immense sadness I felt upon discovering that my specter's departure began to fade. It was replaced with what I can only describe as deep anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt anxious and on edge, especially since it seemed that my ordeal was over. However, shortly after the lunch period, my life took a turn I never expected. My principal, Mr. Cash, came to retrieve me from my classroom with no disclaimer as to what prompted the trip to his office. I wasn't an angel by any means, but I had managed to never land myself in that hot seat, not even once. During the deafeningly quiet 2-minute walk, I tried to recall anything I could have done to get myself in trouble. It wasn't until he opened the door and I saw the worried face of my sister that I knew the trouble didn't lie with me. Our principal, who was normally a cheerful man, wore an expression that told me no good news was to come from there on out. He informed us that there had been an incident and our aunt was on her way to pick us up. Jill instantly began to weep. I didn't grasp what was happening. Why weren't our parents coming to get us? Were they hurt? Was Mom hurt? Did my dad hurt her? Mr. Cash stood up and began to walk towards his office door. He paused beside me momentarily and placed his hand on my shoulder. Without another word, he left us to wait. In between my sister's low sobs, I could hear my heart pounding. The thumping seemed to grow louder as each agonizing second ticked on. It then transitioned to a ringing in my ears. As the ringing was about to reach a fever pitch, the door swung open, revealing my aunt. My aunt wouldn't tell us much. She confirmed that, while our parents weren't hurt, there was an incident, and my mother, my sister, and I would be staying with her for a bit. This statement unleashed a whole new round of questioning. Despite our persistence, our aunt made it clear that my mother had all the answers. Upon arriving at our aunt's house, we found our mother sitting blank-faced and stoic on the couch. You could tell from the puffiness and redness of her eyes that she had been weeping. She immediately outstretched her arms and we melted into them. I still didn't know what terrible thing had happened, but I knew I was happy to be in my mother's arms. After our meaningful embrace, my sister and I each took a seat on either side of our mother as she firmly grasped our hands. She solemnly looked from me to my sister before she began. "Your father did a very, very bad thing, and he won't be coming home anytime soon, if ever," she said, as her voice began to crack. She proceeded to reveal to us that our father had murdered a woman estate over while he was on one of his supposed work trips. Mother didn't go into much detail to try to spare us some trauma, to prevent us from stumbling upon the gruesome facts of it all. We weren't allowed to watch cable or access the internet. We were told we would be taking the rest of the week off of school, maybe longer. This would normally be a 12-year-old's dream, but this felt more like a hellscape. That night, after everyone else had made peace with the Sandman, I crept into the living room and tuned into the local news station. It wasn't long before I saw her. Plastered on the screen, dressed in her jet black cap and gown, was my ghost girl, Anna Elizabeth Collins. She was 19, not much older than my sister. Anna had fallen in with the wrong crowd shortly after graduating high school. She often caught rides with strangers as a means of getting around. Her body had been found by some hikers out in the woods. Our father and his work truck fit the description of the man seen giving her a ride. Police followed him for weeks, waiting for him to slip up. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he had tossed on the ground. It was a match not just for Anna, but for 2 other unsolved missing persons cases. As I stared into those baby blues, I felt tranquility I had never felt before. Though Anna had suffered greatly at the hands of my father, I somehow knew she was at rest now. I turned off the TV and lay on the couch until I drifted off to sleep. That night there was no gagging, tossing and turning, or nightmares. That night I dreamt I was standing in the middle of my room. Anna appeared in my doorway, but not as the mangled corpse I was used to, but how she looked in the photos and videos on the news. Her face was serene and angelic. She glided across the room as the light of her aura filled the entire space around us. She placed a hand on each of my shoulders and gently pulled me into an embrace. I knew that life was going to be very different for my family and me after this, but in that moment I knew we would eventually be okay.